The wrought iron gates swung open before I could even step out of my car. I was standing on the gravel driveway of my fourth multi-million-dollar restoration project, the keys to the massive oak doors weighing heavy in my pocket, while my parents stood there looking at me like I was their last hope on earth. My father, Arthur, had just held out a folder of eviction notices for their own apartment and said, "Juliana, please. We have nowhere else to go. We're family." Then my mother, Beatrice, reached for my hand, the same hand she had slapped 10 years ago when she told me I was a disgrace, and whispered, "We always knew you'd be the one to save us." That was the moment I looked at the house they said I'd never own, and the silence that followed was deafening. But let me back up a little. That morning, I had been at my downtown office, reviewing the blueprints for the Sterling Manor project, a name I chose not out of family pride, but as a silent irony. I was tired in that deep-down way that comes from building an empire from the dirt up, the kind of tired that reminds you of every double shift and every night spent sleeping on a cold floor. But I was happy. I was finally about to unveil my masterpiece. Around 10 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a number I hadn't seen in years. It was Arthur. "Juliana, we're at the gate of your new property. We need to talk. It's urgent." I stared at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. After a decade of silence, after being told I was financially illiterate and a lost cause, they had tracked me down. I remember the day it all started. Exactly 10 years ago, I was 18, sitting at the mahogany dining table of the house I grew up in. Arthur had called a family meeting, which was usually just a code for him praising my older brother, Quentin, while I sat in the shadow. Quentin was 22 then, the golden child who had just failed out of his third prestigious business school. "We've made a decision," Arthur said, his voice cold as he looked at me. "The college fund we set aside for you is being liquidated. Quentin needs the capital to start his tech firm. It's an investment in the family's real future." I felt the air leave my lungs. "And my tuition? My architecture degree?" Beatrice didn't even look up from her tea. "Juliana, be realistic. You've always been a dreamer with no head for numbers. You just waste that money on some flighty art degree and end up broke. Quentin has the sterling blood for business. You'll be lucky if you ever own a roof over your head. In fact, we expect you to move out by the end of the month. You need to learn how the real world works since you won't have us to carry you." I moved out with 2 suitcases and $84 in my pocket. I spent the first 6 months working as a waitress during the day and a cleaning lady at night. I lived in a studio apartment that smelled like damp cardboard and old cigarettes, but every cent I earned was a brick in the wall I was building between me and their low expectations. While Quentin was blowing through my college fund on networking events in Vegas and high-end office rentals for a company that didn't even have a product, I was at the local library, teaching myself the basics of real estate law and construction management. One night, about 2 years into my journey, I saw Arthur and Beatrice at a local grocery store. I was wearing my stained work uniform from the diner. I tried to say hello, to show them I was working hard, but Arthur just looked at my name tag and sneered. "Still serving coffee, I see. I told you, Juliana. You don't have the grit for the sterling name. You'll always be a tenant in someone else's success. Don't come crawling back when you can't pay your rent." Beatrice just turned her back, adjusting her pearl necklace. That was the last time I spoke to them until today, but I didn't break. I saved. I lived on ramen and grit. When I was 21, I found it, a derelict, Victorian-style house on the outskirts of the city. It was a wreck, rotting floorboards, a roof that leaked like a sieve, and a garden that looked like a jungle. The bank wouldn't even look at me, but the owner was desperate to offload the eyesore. I used every penny of my savings for the down payment and moved into the construction zone. I did the plumbing. I did the wiring. I sanded the floors until my fingers bled. I remember the day I finally finished that first house. It was beautiful. I sold it for 3 times what I paid. That was the moment I realized that Arthur and Beatrice weren't just wrong, they were my greatest motivation. Every no they had ever said to me became a yes I said to myself. By the time I was 25, I own 3 properties. By 27, I had started JS Restorations, specializing in luxury historical flips. And now, here I was, standing in the driveway of my most expensive acquisition yet, the Henderson estate. It was a sprawling, 3-story mansion with Greek Revival columns and a view that overlooked the entire valley. And there they were. Arthur looked frail, his expensive suit now hanging loosely on a frame that had lost its posture. Beatrice's hair was no longer perfectly coiffed, it was thin and graying. They looked like people who had been defeated by the very world they thought they owned. "How did you find me?" I asked, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside. Arthur cleared his throat, avoiding the gaze of the security cameras I had installed. "The newspapers, Juliana. The rising queen of restoration. We saw your face. We saw this house." Beatrice stepped forward, her voice trembling. "We're so proud of you, honey. We always knew you had this in you. We had to be hard on you to make you tough. You see that now, don't you?" The lie was so thick it made me want to gag. I thought back to that dining room table, to the way they looked at me like I was a broken tool. They didn't make me tough. They tried to break me so they could justify giving everything to Quentin. "Where is Quentin?" I asked. The silence that followed was heavy. Arthur looked at the ground. "Quentin, he made some mistakes. The firm didn't work out. Then there were the loans. He used our house as collateral. He said it was a sure thing." I felt a cold shiver of realization. "The family home? The one you told me I'd never be good enough to live in?" Beatrice began to cry, real, ugly tears that smeared her makeup. "It's gone, Juliana. The bank took it last month. We've been staying in a motel, but the money is gone. Quentin disappeared 3 weeks ago. He won't answer our calls." I looked at the folder in Arthur's hand. Eviction notices. They weren't just here to talk, they were here to beg. They had spent 10 years treating me like a failure, and now that their investment had crumbled, they expected to move into the palace I had built with the sweat they told me I'd never have to use. "We saw your listing for the guest house on the north wing," Arthur said, his voice regaining a tiny, pathetic shred of its old authority. "It's empty. Surely, you wouldn't let your own parents sleep on the street." I looked up at the towering columns of the house. I thought about the nights I spent sleeping in a sleeping bag on a dusty subfloor because I couldn't afford a bed. I thought about the cold winter when I didn't have heat because I was pouring every cent into a new roof. They had never checked on me. Not once. "You told me I'd never own a home, Arthur. You told me I was a liability, Beatrice. We were wrong." Beatrice wailed, reaching for my arm again. "Can't you see we're suffering? We're your parents." I pulled my arm back, not out of anger, but out of a strange, hollow sense of clarity. I wasn't the little girl at the mahogany table anymore. I was the woman who built the table. I looked at the mansion, then back at them. I had a choice to make, one that would define the next 10 years of my life. "The guest house is for rent," I said, my voice as cold as the marble inside the foyer. "It's not for charity." Arthur's eyes lit up with a flicker of hope. Of course, of course. We can work out a family rate. Something symbolic, until we get back on our feet." I shook my head slowly. "No, Arthur. You taught me how the real world works, remember? In the real world, there are no family rates for people who liquidate their daughter's future. There is only the market value. And the market value for that guest house is $4,000 a month." Arthur's face went pale. "Juliana, we don't have that kind of money. We have our Social Security and a small pension. We were hoping." I stepped closer to him, seeing the fear in his eyes. "You were hoping I'd forgotten. You were hoping I was still that flighty girl you could manipulate. But you were right about one thing, I learned my lesson well. I learned that a sterling only invests in a real future. And right now, my future doesn't include carrying the people who tried to sink me." Beatrice let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. You would turn us away? After everything we gave you? I laughed then, a short, sharp sound that echoed off the stone walls of the driveway. What did you give me, Beatrice? You gave me a suitcase and a deadline. You gave me a front row seat to your favoritism. You gave me the motivation to never, ever be like you. I turned toward the massive oak doors, the keys cold in my hand. I could feel their eyes on my back, the desperation radiating off them like heat. Part of me, the part that still wanted to be loved, screamed at me to turn around and give them a room. But the woman I had become knew that some debts can never be paid, and some bridges are better left burned. As I reached for the handle, Arthur called out one last time, his voice cracking with a mix of rage and despair. You're heartless. We should have known you'd turn out like this. I paused, my hand on the door. I didn't turn around. You didn't want a daughter, Arthur. You wanted an insurance policy. And unfortunately for you, this policy just expired. I pushed the door open and stepped into the foyer, the smell of fresh paint and expensive wood greeting me like a victory. But as the door clicked shut, I heard a sound that made me freeze. It wasn't the sound of them leaving. It was the sound of a third car pulling up the driveway, tires screeching on the gravel. I looked at the security monitor by the door. My heart stopped. It was a black sedan I didn't recognize, but the man who stepped out made my blood run cold. It was Quentin. He didn't look like a failure, he looked like a man on a mission, and he was carrying a manila envelope that looked exactly like the one Arthur had been holding. But as he approached my parents, he didn't hug them. He handed them a paper, and the look of horror that crossed Beatrice's face told me that the nightmare was far from over. Quentin looked up at the security camera, a smirk playing on his lips, and mouthed 3 words that changed everything. I found it. The gravel crunched under Quentin's designer loafers as he walked toward us, that same arrogant smirk I hadn't seen in 3 years plastered across his face. He didn't look like a man who had lost millions of the family's money, he looked like a man who had just found a winning lottery ticket. Beatrice's hand was still over her mouth, her eyes darting between Quentin and the manila envelope. Arthur, however, seemed to find a sudden surge of strength. He straightened his back, his desperate plea for a family raid on the guest house vanishing instantly as he looked at his son. Quentin, Arthur breathed, his voice thick with a new kind of greed. Is it true? Did you find the paperwork for the north lot? Quentin didn't look at his father. He kept his eyes locked on mine, or rather, on the security camera lens right above the door. I found more than that, Dad, he said, tapping the envelope against his palm. I found the reason why our real estate mogul daughter thinks she can treat her own blood like trespassers. I stepped out from the threshold, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind me. I didn't need them seeing the inside of my home, not yet. The interior of the Sterling estate was a masterpiece of architectural restoration, every crown molding and marble floor a testament to my survival. To let them in now would be to invite the rot back into the foundation. Quentin. I see you've traded your dignity for a black sedan. Did you borrow that, or is it another investment from Mom and Dad's dwindling retirement? I asked, my voice cutting through the humid afternoon air. Keep talking, Jules, Quentin sneered, finally standing face to face with me. He was 32 now, but he still had the aura of a spoiled teenager who had never been told no. You always were the smart one. The architectural restoration expert. You spent years digging into the history of this old estate before you bought it at that foreclosure auction. But you missed one very important detail in the historical record. A detail that Mom and Dad were too distracted to remember until I dug it up. Beatrice stepped forward, her voice trembling. Quentin, honey, are you sure? If this is real. It's real, Mom, Quentin interrupted. He pulled a yellowed, fragile piece of paper from the envelope. It looked like a land survey, but it was stamped with a seal I recognized all too well, the original county registrar from 1924. This mansion sits on what used to be the Sterling Vein partition. When the land was subdivided in the 60s, there was an easement error. A 50-foot strip of land, the very strip that contains your grand foyer and half the master wing, was never legally part of the parcel you purchased at auction, Juliana. It was held in a separate private trust. A trust that was never dissolved because the taxes were being paid by a dormant corporate entity. Arthur let out a triumphant laugh, a sound that made my skin crawl. The Sterling legacy. Your grandfather set that trust up for the lineage. Not for the flighty daughters who run away to the city. He wanted the core of the Sterling land to stay with the men of the family. I felt a cold breeze whip through the oak trees, but I didn't blink. I looked at the document in Quentin's hand. I knew every inch of this property's history. I had spent 6 months in the archives before I even placed a bid. You're claiming an easement encroachment, Quentin? That's your play? You think 100-year-old clerical error gives you a right to my front door? I'm claiming the foyer is on my land, Juliana, Quentin said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. Which means you're technically trespassing on Sterling family property every time you walk from your kitchen to your bedroom, which means those $4,000 a month you wanted to charge mom and dad. How about we talk about the back rent you owe us for occupying this land for the last 2 years? Or better yet, how about you just hand over the keys and we call it even on the legal fees I'm about to bury you in? Beatrice's face shifted instantly. The desperation I had seen moments ago, the woman who had practically been on her knees begging for a place to stay, was gone. In its place was the cold, calculating woman who had handed me a suitcase 10 years ago and told me I was dead weight because I wouldn't stop complaining about Quentin stealing my savings. You heard your brother, Juliana, Beatrice said, her voice regaining its sharp, aristocratic edge. We tried to be civil. We came here asking for help, and you spit in our faces. You acted like we were some charity case. But now? Now the tables have turned. This is a Sterling home. It always should have been. It's only right that Quentin takes his place as the head of the estate, and we take our place in the master wing, not the guest house. I looked at the three of them. Arthur, the man who had liquidated my college fund to pay for Quentin's third failed tech startup. Beatrice, who had watched me work 3 jobs to put myself through school and never once called to ask if I was eating. And Quentin, the golden child who had bled them dry and was now looking for one last score. You really haven't changed, I said, my voice eerily calm. I give you a chance to walk away with your dignity, and the moment you think you have a weapon, you try to cut my throat. You didn't come here to rent, did you? You came here to scout the property. Quentin was waiting around the corner the whole time, waiting for the signal. Does it matter? Arthur snapped. We have the paperwork. This house is built on a lie, Juliana. Your success is built on our land. You stole this property at a foreclosure auction when it should have come to us. Is that so? I asked. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my phone. I didn't call the police. I didn't call a lawyer. I opened a high-resolution PDF file, the result of my own 3-year investigation into the Sterling vein partitioned. I had known this moment might come. I knew how my family operated. Quentin, I said, stepping closer until our shoes were touching. You're right about one thing. There was an easement error in 1924. And you're right that the trust was never dissolved. But you should have read the fine print of the 1988 amendment. The one our grandfather signed 3 days before he died, while you were busy failing middle school. Quentin's smirk flickered. What amendment? There was no amendment recorded. There was, I said, turning the phone screen toward him. Grandfather knew exactly what you were, Arthur. He saw how you were already starting to gamble away the family legacy even back then. So he didn't leave the trust to the Sterling sons. He left it to the Sterling descendants who hold a professional degree in architecture, structural engineering, or land management. He wanted to make sure the land was actually taken care of, not sold off for parts by a bunch of grifters who can't read a balance sheet. I watched as the blood drained from Quentin's face. He was a business school dropout who had never graduated. Arthur was a retired salesman who had never held a professional license in his life. Beatrice had never worked a day. I'm the only one with the credentials, Quentin, I whispered, the words tasting like victory. I dissolved that trust and merged it with the primary deed the day I closed on this house. I didn't miss the detail. I bought the detail. I own the 50-foot strip. I own the foyer. I own the air you're breathing right now on my driveway. The silence that followed was absolute. The birds seemed to stop chirping. Arthur reached for the phone, his hands shaking, but I pulled it back. You thought you found a loophole to take what I worked for, I said, looking at each of them in turn. But all you did was prove, one last time, that you are the same people who threw me out in the rain 10 years ago. You don't want a home. You want a prize. And you will never, ever have mine. Not even for $10,000 a month. Beatrice started to cry, but it wasn't the cry of a mother seeking a daughter's love. It was the wail of someone who had just realized the gold mine was empty. Juliana, please, we have nowhere else to go. The bank is taking the apartment on Monday. Quentin said this would work. He said we'd be back in a mansion by sunset. So it was a conspiracy, I said, nodding slowly. You didn't just come to rent. You came to stage a hostile takeover. My own parents tried to use a fraudulent land claim to evict me from my own home. We were desperate. Arthur shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and fear. What were we supposed to do? You're a millionaire. You have dozens of properties. Why do you need this one so badly? Because I earned this one, I said. Every brick. Every beam. Every drop of sweat it took to restore this place while I was sleeping on a floor in a studio apartment because my father stole my tuition money to pay for Quentin's entrepreneurial dreams. I don't owe you a room. I don't even owe you an explanation. But I will give you a piece of advice, the bank apartment is gone. I suggest you start looking at motels. Far away from here. I turned back to the door, but Quentin grabbed my arm. His grip was tight, desperate, his eyes bloodshot with the realization that his last hope was gone. You can't do this, Jules. We're family. You can't let your own parents sleep in a car while you live in a 30-room mansion. Think of the scandal. Think of what the sterling name will mean when people find out. I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up at his eyes. Family is a verb, Quentin. It's something you do, not something you are by blood. And for 10 years, you've done nothing but try to erase me. As for the sterling name? I'm the only one who hasn't dragged it through the dirt. I shook his hand off with a force that surprised him. Now, I'm going to give you 10 seconds to get off my property before I call my security team. And believe me, they aren't as flighty as I am. Juliana. Beatrice screamed as I stepped inside. You'll regret this. You're cold. You're just like your grandfather. Heartless and obsessed with your work. Thank you, I said, and I meant it. My grandfather was the only one who had seen my potential, the only one who had taught me that a building is only as strong as its foundation. That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me. The heavy oak door clicked shut, muffling their screams and their curses. I leaned my back against the wood, closing my eyes, listening to the muffled sound of Quentin's car door slamming and the screech of tires as they realized the game was truly over. I expected to feel a surge of triumph. I expected to feel the weight lift off my shoulders. But instead, all I felt was a profound, hollow silence. I was 28 years old, I was one of the most successful developers in the state, and I was officially, completely alone. But as I walked through the grand foyer, the foyer I now knew I owned down to the very soil beneath the marble, my phone vibrated. It was a text from my lead foreman at the downtown project. Juliana, we've got a problem at the old textile mill. Someone's claiming they have a superior lien on the title. You need to get down here. It looks like the same law firm your brother used to work for. My blood ran cold. Quentin hadn't just come here with an envelope. He had been digging into my entire portfolio. This wasn't just about a house. This was a war. And as I looked out the side window and saw Quentin getting back into the black sedan, he wasn't looking at his crying parents. He was looking at his phone, a dark, victorious smile playing on his lips. He hadn't lost. He had just started. I realized then that my parents weren't the real threat, they were just the bait. Quentin had spent the last 3 years in the shadows, learning the inner workings of the real estate law firms I used, and he was coming for everything I had built. I didn't have time to mourn the family I never had. I had to protect the empire I had created. I grabbed my keys, bypassed the front door to avoid the lingering remains of my parents' pride, and headed for the garage. If Quentin wanted to play with titles and liens, I would show him why they called me the architectural restoration expert. I didn't just fix buildings, I reinforced them. And I was about to turn my entire life into a fortress. As I pulled out of the hidden back gate, I saw them in the rearview mirror. Arthur and Beatrice were standing by the mailbox, looking up at the house they would never enter. They looked small. They looked pathetic. But as I sped toward the downtown mill, I knew that the hardest part of my journey wasn't behind me. It was waiting for me in the fine print of a contract I had signed years ago. Quentin had found a ghost in my past. And if I didn't find it first, he was going to use it to burn my future to the ground. The textile mill restoration was my crown jewel, a $40 million project that would revitalize the entire historic district. If Quentin managed to freeze that title, he wouldn't just be hurting me, he'd be bankrupting the investors who had put their trust in me. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing. I needed to know exactly who Quentin was working with, because a failed businessman doesn't just wake up one day and find legal loopholes in multi-million-dollar developments. He had help. And that help was likely someone who knew me just as well as he did. As I pulled up to the construction site, the flashing lights of a private security vehicle caught my eye. My foreman, Marcus, was standing near the gate, arguing with a man in a sharp gray suit. The man looked familiar, too familiar. He was the same lawyer who had represented my father during the liquidation of my college fund 10 years ago. The pieces were starting to fit together, and the picture they formed was darker than I had ever imagined. This wasn't just about Quentin. This was a long-game revenge plot, and my parents were only the beginning. The man in the gray suit adjusted his glasses, looking down at a stack of documents with a clinical coldness that made my skin crawl. This was Silas Vance, the same man who had looked me in the eye 10 years ago and told me that my dreams of owning property were statistically impossible for someone of my temperament. Back then, he was the Sterling family's bulldog, the one who ensured that every cent of my potential inheritance was diverted to Quentin's failed tech startups. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "I assume you're lost. This is a private construction site, not a bankruptcy court." Vance didn't flinch. He handed a single sheet of paper to Marcus, who passed it to me with a look of pure frustration. "We aren't here for a bankruptcy, Juliana. We're here to enforce the Sterling ancestral clause. Your brother Quentin was quite thorough in his research." I scanned the document. My eye stopped at a signature at the bottom. It was my own, dated exactly 10 years ago, on my 18th birthday. I remembered that day. My parents had taken me to a celebratory dinner where they presented me with a stack of papers they claimed were for my first adult savings account. I had been so desperate for their approval, so hungry for a crumb of familial trust, that I had signed where they pointed. I had been an architectural restoration expert for years, but I had neglected to restore the history of my own legal identity. "This is a lien against the land the mill sits on," Vance explained, his voice sounding like dry parchment. "The document you signed tied any future real estate acquisitions to a family-controlled trust for a period of 15 years, provided the initial seed money came from a Sterling source. Since your first small studio apartment was purchased with a loan from your father, a loan you repaid, mind you, the fruit of the vine clause applies to every subsequent property you've developed." "That loan was $5,000, I hissed. "This project is worth $40 million. The law doesn't care about the scale, Juliana. It cares about the chain of title," Vance said. "Until this is resolved, all work on the textile mill must cease. Your investors have already been notified." I looked at Marcus. He looked devastated. Behind us, the sounds of hammers and drills began to die down as word spread among the crew. This was Quentin's masterstroke. He didn't need to win a long-term court case. He just needed to freeze my cash flow for 60 days. If the mill project stalled, the interest on my construction loans would eat me alive. I would be forced to liquidate my personal assets, including the home my parents were currently begging to inhabit. "Where is he?" I asked. "Your brother is at your parents' hotel, preparing the settlement offer," Vance replied. "I suggest you go there. Every hour this site stays quiet is an hour you move closer to total insolvency." I didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. I climbed back into my car, my mind working at a speed that would have terrified my younger self. I wasn't that 18-year-old girl anymore. I was a woman who built fortresses out of ruins. If Quentin wanted to play with the foundations of my life, he was going to find out exactly how much reinforcement I had put into the walls. I drove toward the mid-range hotel where Arthur and Beatrice were staying. As I navigated the city streets, I called my lead counsel, Sarah. I didn't tell her about my feelings, I gave her the technical specs of the lien. "Juliana, if that signature is valid, we're in trouble," Sarah said, her voice tight. "But there's a loophole in the state's 2018 Real Estate Modernization Act. If the seed money was repaid with interest and the trust was never formally registered with the state comptroller, the clause is voidable. But we need the original ledger from your father's old business." "The business that went under 3 years ago?" I asked. "Exactly. Quentin probably has it. Or he's destroyed it." I pulled up to the hotel. I saw the black sedan parked out front. Quentin was sitting in the lobby, a laptop open on his knees, looking every bit the successful executive he had never actually managed to be. Arthur and Beatrice were sitting on a nearby floral sofa, looking like two people who had just been told they won the lottery but weren't sure how to cash the ticket. When I walked in, Quentin didn't even look up. 38 minutes. "You're getting slower, Jules. I expected you here in 20. "Let's skip the theatrics, Quentin," I said, standing over him. "You found a predatory clause in a document I signed when I was a teenager. You're trying to hijack a $40 million restoration project because you ran your own life into the ground. What's the number?" Arthur stood up, his face reddening. "Juliana, don't speak to your brother that way. He's trying to save this family. He told us that you've been hiding sterling assets in this mill project, assets that rightfully belong to us." I looked at my father, and for a second, I felt a flash of the old pity. He actually believed him. Quentin had convinced our parents that my success was actually a theft from them. It was the only way their pride could survive the reality of their failure. If I was a thief, then they weren't failures for needing my help, they were simply reclaiming what was theirs. "Is that what he told you?" I asked quietly. "That I stole the money for the mill from the family trust?" "Dad, there was no trust left. Quentin spent it all on that crypto mining warehouse in 2021. I have the receipts from the liquidation sale." Beatrice scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "Quentin explained that. He said you manipulated the audits to make it look like he was at fault. But he's found the truth now. He showed us the ancestral clause." Quentin finally looked up, his eyes cold and triumphant. "The offer is simple, Juliana. You sign over 49% of the mill's holding company to the new Sterling Trust. We'll appoint Dad as the chairman, with a healthy salary, of course, and I'll serve as the managing director. In exchange, I'll release the lien, and we'll allow you to keep your house. We might even let you stay in the guest wing if you're humble enough." I felt a laugh bubbling up in my throat, a sharp, jagged sound. "You want to be the managing director of my company? Quentin, you couldn't manage a lemonade stand without losing the pitcher." "Watch your tone," Quentin snapped, standing up to face me. "I have the law on my side. Vance is already filing the secondary injunctions. By tomorrow morning, your bank accounts will be frozen. You'll be begging us for a place to sleep." I took a step closer to him, lowering my voice so only he could hear. "You don't have the original ledger, do you?" You have a copy. Because if you had the original, you'd know that the $5,000 loan wasn't a loan at all. It was a partial payout from Grandma's estate that Dad tried to hide from the taxman. Quentin's eyes flickered. It was a split second of doubt, but for an expert in restoration, a flicker is all you need to find the structural crack. I'm going to give you one chance, Quentin, I said, loud enough for my parents to hear now. And I'm saying this in front of witnesses. Walk away now. Withdraw the lien. If you do, I will buy Mom and Dad a modest 2-bedroom condo, in their names, not mine. I will provide them with a monthly stipend that covers their basic needs, but you? You get nothing. You leave this city and you never contact me again. Arthur gasped. A condo? Juliana, we deserve the penthouse. We are your parents. You were my parents, I corrected him. Now, you're just people I'm trying to keep off the street out of a sense of duty I'm starting to regret. This is the only offer you're getting. Quentin laughed, a harsh, desperate sound. She's bluffing. She's terrified. Look at her. She's trying to buy us off because she knows Vance has her trapped. We don't take the condo, Dad. We take the empire. Beatrice looked at Quentin, then at me. For a moment, I saw a glimmer of the mother who used to tuck me in, before the bitterness took her over. But then she looked at my expensive watch, my designer suit, and the keys to my luxury car, the NV1. We stand with our son, Beatrice said firmly. Fine, I said, stepping back. I hope the hotel has a good continental breakfast. Because starting tomorrow, your credit cards, the ones Quentin has been piggybacking on, are going to start bouncing. I walked out of the hotel before they could respond. As I reached my car, my heart was hammering against my ribs. I had made a bold claim about the ledger, but I didn't actually have it. I just knew my father. He was a man of shortcuts and shadows. There was no way that $5,000 had been a clean loan. I needed that ledger. And I knew exactly where it was. It wasn't with Quentin. It was in the one place the Sterlings had abandoned years ago and never looked back, the basement of our childhood home, which had been foreclosed on and was currently sitting in a state of mid-renovation by a rival developer. I didn't head to my office. I headed to the outskirts of the city, to the house with the peeling white paint and the coming soon signs in the yard. I was an architectural restoration expert. I knew how to get into a building that didn't want me there. And I knew that some ghosts were better off being dug up than ignored. As I pulled up to the old Sterling estate, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, skeletal shadows across the porch where I used to sit and wait for a father who never came home happy. I gripped my flashlight and my heavy-duty work gloves. Quentin thought he was playing a legal game. He didn't realize I was playing a game of foundations. And I was about to tear his down to the dirt. I found it in the corner of the basement, behind a false stone I remembered seeing Arthur tinker with when I was 6. The leather-bound ledger was more than just paper, it was a map of every lie my father had ever told. It detailed the loan that was actually my grandmother's inheritance, money intended for my education that Arthur had siphoned into his failing ventures. The next morning, I didn't go to the hotel. I went to the district attorney's office. When I finally sat across from Quentin, Arthur, and Beatrice in my lawyer's boardroom, the air was thick with their misplaced confidence. Quentin shoved a settlement paper toward me. Sign it, Juliana, give up the assets, and we'll let you keep your reputation. I didn't reach for the pen. I reached for the ledger. This is a record of tax evasion, estate fraud, and embezzlement, I said, my voice as steady as the foundations I spent my life repairing. The $5,000 wasn't a loan, Dad. It was stolen. And Quentin, the legal work you did to hide it makes you an accomplice. I'm not signing your settlement. I'm handing this to the authorities unless you withdraw every claim and leave this city by sunset. The color drained from Quentin's face. He knew the law well enough to know he was looking at a prison cell. Arthur tried to speak, but for the first time in my life, I saw him for what he really was, a small man standing in the wreckage of a house he never built. They signed the withdrawals. They fled. 10 years passed. My firm, Sterling Restorations, became the premier developer in the tri-state area. I didn't just own a home, I owned blocks of them. I had built a legacy out of the ruins they left behind. One rainy Tuesday, my secretary buzzed me. A Mr. and Mrs. Sterling are here. They don't have an appointment, but they say it's urgent. I let them in. Arthur and Beatrice looked decades older than they were. They were living in a cramped, moldy apartment on the edge of town, and the building had just been sold to, you guessed it, me. They didn't come to apologize. They came to ask for a family discount on one of my luxury rentals. Juliana, Beatrice whispered, her eyes darting around my mahogany office. We're your parents. You can't let us live like that. Just let us rent the penthouse on 5th Street. We'll pay what we can. I looked at them, and I didn't feel anger. I felt nothing. I'm sorry, I said, closing the folder on my desk. But I have a strict policy. I only rent to people who respect the property and have a history of honesty. Based on your records, you're a high-risk liability. I can't have you in my buildings. I watched them walk out, the very people who said I'd never own a home now begging to live in one of mine. I didn't win because I got rich. I won because I built a life they could never touch. True success isn't about the title on the deed, it's about the integrity of the person who holds the keys to. If you believe that your past doesn't define your future, leave a comment below. If this story reminded you to keep building your own foundation, subscribe for more. Thank you for listening. The end.